We can begin this second session. Robert Browning Hamilton wrote, "I walked a mile with pleasure. She chatted all the way, but left me none the wiser for all she had to say. I walked a mile with sorrow, and ne'er a word said she. But oh, the things I learned from her when sorrow walked with me." Everybody has a story. You do. Some of you are here today because you have a story. I want to tell you mine. I graduated from Ohio Valley College in Parkersburg, West Virginia in 1965. I had been preaching for a little church over across the river in Ohio for the 2 years that I was in college. Never really planned to be a preacher. My father had been a preacher, was a preacher. I had seen the underbelly of it, and I decided that's not what I wanted to do. I wanted to teach school. A number of the Millers were school teachers, and I thought that was kind of in my blood. The church in Elkins, West Virginia, asked my father if he would consider moving. He said no, but my son Tommy has just graduated from college, 2 years. Would you consider him? And they said no. We've had some problems. We need an older, experienced preacher. Would you consider coming again? He said no, but would you consider my son again? And so out of respect for my dad, they asked me to come. Told me up front, we're looking for an older, more experienced preacher. I was 21 years old, newly married, and they hired me. I stayed for 12 years. While there, I learned that the little college in the town, Davis and Elkins College, associated with the Presbyterian Church, offered a class a semester for a townie, someone who lived in the town, for $50. I thought, I'm going to go to college. And so about every semester, I took a class. I had also become the chaplain for the Huttonsville Correctional Center. The warden was a member of the church and attended the church in Elkins. And so I said, I'll take classes in psychology, in counseling. It's what I need. It was there that I came in contact with the idea of death, dying, and grief. I was introduced to the works of Kubler-Ross, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, a pioneer in the field of grief. After being there 12 years, I moved to Canton, Ohio to preach for the church. Was there 7 years, and after that moved to Camden Avenue in Parkersburg. I left a church of 140 or 50 to go to a church of 400, to go to a church of between 600 and 700. I was up and coming. I spoke on the lectureships, held meetings. I had had some experience with grief, grandparents, but it was at Parkersburg that I had the lowest moment in my life. My wife, at 39, was diagnosed with breast cancer. The doctor said, she's young, no family experience, history. It's probably benign, but we'll do a biopsy. And they did. He came into the waiting room. I thought, no bedside manner at all. He said, "Mr. Miller, it's bad. It's very bad." And it was like being hit between the eyes with a sledgehammer. She lived for 2.5 years, in and out of the hospital, chemotherapy, radiation. It's gone, it's back, it's gone, it's back. And in October of 1987, she died. I had learned some things about grief from being in college classes. But most of what I learned about grief, I learned the same way you learned it. You walked with it. It wasn't long after that I realized that I could not stay in Parkersburg and preach for the Camden Avenue Church. Half of the people were telling me they couldn't imagine me ever being with anybody else, and the other half was trying to fix me up with her old maid aunt. I moved to this fair area, to Knoxville. Preached for the South Knoxville Church. I've been there a year or so, and David Farr called me. David was the director of the School of Preaching. He said, "Would you come and speak to our students about grief?" And I said, "No." I said, "David, I don't think I can do that. It's still too fresh." He said, "But our students need to know about grief. They need to hear somebody's story." And I said, "Well, good luck with that. I don't think I can do that." He said, "They really need to hear what you have to say." And so I went to the School of Preaching, and one Saturday, I spent most of the day talking to the students about grief. They taped those presentations on cassettes. Does that tell you anything about the era? And some people got a hold of them, and I began getting calls, "Come and talk to us about grief." So since that time, which would have been in about 1960 or about 1988, I've spoken, I cannot tell you how many times, about grief. The only way I know to do it is to tell you my story and what I learned about it. Now, it's painful. I compare it to picking a scab off of a sore. You can hurt yourself and a scab forms, and you know it's there, but it's okay, and then you pick at it or you hit it against something and the scab comes off, and it's like you're there all over again. And so every time I talk about grief, I pick the scab off. But I want to tell you some things that I've told other people all over this country, the things that I learned. I learned that everybody grieves. Now, everybody doesn't grieve the same way, but everybody grieves. When my wife died, my daughter, Jody, who is here today, and I grieved the same way. We yelled and screamed and cried and threw things. My son, Jeffrey, who was a mama's boy, shut down. Never cried that I saw. Just retreated. Didn't want to talk about it. It took me a while to learn that he was grieving as badly as I was, just differently. But everybody grieves. And we grieve not only from the loss of a loved one, we grieve at any significant loss. Anything that you lose that you count valuable to you, precious to you, when you lose it, you grieve. I have people who don't like animals, wouldn't think of having a pet. My wife and I are cat people. And I can't tell you the times that we've gone to the vet and held a pet while they were put to sleep. And we cried and we grieved because that pet was precious to us. We grieve at divorce, at the loss of a friend, when a child leaves home, when we move, when we retire. A woman grieves when she loses her hair from radiation or chemotherapy, and when she loses a breast to cancer. We grieve over our health. Several people said it was good to see me this morning, and they were glad to know that I was doing better. They had prayed for me. Last month was a bad month. Went to the emergency room 3 times and had 3 surgeries. And I grieved. I grieve over the loss of my health. I appreciate the people who can stand up here and be robust and face you, and I sit in a chair because I can't do that anymore. And so I grieve. Anytime we lose something we value, that we treasure, we grieve. We just don't do it the same way. I had a former student come to see me recently. He lives in another state. He knew that I had talked at the school of preaching and the preacher and his work about grief, and he said, Tom, he had lost his wife, I will tell you, and he said, Tom, tell me what to do. I don't know what to do. And I said, Bill, I can't. I can't tell you what to do, because you'll grieve the way you grieve. You may want to talk about it, you may not. You may cry, you may not. You may want to be alone, you may want to be with people. You may be able to sleep, you may not be able to sleep. I cannot tell you how to grieve. It's universal to grieve, it's individual. The way you grieve, that's a hard thing to learn. Because you see, I think people ought to grieve the way I grieve. And when they don't, I wonder what's wrong with them. The reality is that nothing's wrong with them. They're just processing that loss in the way that they must process that loss. And I believe I have to give them space. I think I have to give them time to do that. I learned that I was ill prepared to grieve. I'd read the books. I'd tried to help other people who were grieving. But this time it was different. It was me. I was the one grieving. And I will tell you that I did not handle it well. I had some knee-jerk reactions. I became angry. I was mad at everybody, including God. She was 41 when she died. A finer Christian lady I've never known. And yet, she would never hold her first grandchild. She would never see a child of hers married. And I thought, God, how can you? I was angry with the doctors because they told me it was going to be okay, and it wasn't. I was angry at myself. Why didn't I insist that she have a more radical procedure? I was angry at the church because they didn't know what to do with me either. I remember standing at the door looking outside at our house and crying, and Jody, who was a senior at Freed Hardeman at the time, saying, "Dad, I don't know what to do with you." I didn't know what to do with me either. I made some stupid decisions. I didn't leave the church. I didn't quit preaching. But I tell you what, I was in a very, very bad place. It was a dark hole for me. And I need to know that people who are grieving are there too. I can't always expect them to be bright and bubbly. Sometimes I have to cry with them. I was ill-equipped to grieve. I learned that others really didn't know how to help me grieve either. Now, my friends and church family did the best they could do. I'm not faulting them. They were there. They visited with me. They held my hand. They prepared food and brought it to me. But you see, I was the preacher. So when I walked into the building on Sunday morning, I tried to be the preacher. They didn't know about Saturday night, sleeping alone in a king-size bed, when you hadn't done that for 22 years. Some of them expected me to snap right back. You're doing well, aren't you? You're about over this. I want you to know you never get over it. You never get over it. To this day, I'm not over it. And why should I be? How can you love somebody for 22 years, the mother of your children, and then act like she didn't exist? Jody has moved in with Sierra and me for a little while because of Sierra's treatments for her breast cancer and because of all of the things I've gone through. And she and I were riding in the van the other day, and she said, "That makes me think of Mom." Well, I had to stop for a moment because she calls Sierra Mom. And she says, "It seems so long ago, but some days it just seems like yesterday." And I knew what she was talking about. And to this day, I think of Judy. I mention her. I talk about her. I see her in Jody and Jeff. I find a little note that she wrote. I see something she gave me. And I'm not over it. I'm able to function, I think. But my normal is a new normal. Things are very different. Some of the people didn't include me in activities because I was no longer married. I was now single. And so when couples got together, I wasn't invited. I understood that, but it was still hurtful. And I still remember that holiday dinner when one of our elders' wives said, "Tom, you sit here on the end because you don't have anybody I have to seat you by along the side of the table." Now, she did not mean to hurt me, but I knew that. I knew I didn't have anybody to be seated beside. And I grieved. And some people said some thoughtless things. Now, they didn't mean for them to be thoughtless. They meant well. They were things that they had heard other people say, I'm sure. But things I wish they hadn't said. They said, I know how you feel. And I wanted to scream, no, you don't. You may have lost a wife, too, but you don't feel like I do. Because everybody has different ways to feel. And we can all experience the same thing and feel very differently about it. It has to do with relationships. It has to do with the way you're made up. So they didn't know how I felt, and I resented them saying they did. They said, well, you had her for 22 years. Yeah, that's right. But that's not what I planned. I planned for a whole lot more than that. I was thankful for the 22, but it wasn't enough. They said, she's better off now, and I knew that. I didn't want her back to suffer. I well remember the doctors giving her morphine, it knocking her out immediately and her waking back up in just a matter of minutes, again screaming with pain. I remember the day the doctor came into the room and said, I'm going to do something, but don't you dare tell it. If you tell it, I could lose my medical license. And he shut the door. He turned her over and he cut the nerves in her back. And said, at least you won't feel it now. I was glad she was no longer in pain. And I believe she was better off. But that didn't help me at the time. They said, you're young. You'll find somebody else. And I thought there couldn't be anybody else. Now, there ultimately was. And I'm happy. And people who say they have a trouble finding one good wife, I found two. And I'm thankful. But others didn't know how to react to me. And let me say to those of us who are grieving, I think we have to learn to be patient with people. Yeah, they don't know what to say. They try, they do their best. Be patient, be gentle. I would rather them say the wrong thing than ignore me and act like nothing happened. I learned that grief is a painful process. It's not an event. It's not something you just go and you grieve and then you don't grieve. I remember being asked by a preacher to go visit a member, a man in his 80s. He'd been married to his wife for 60 years and she passed away. This was about 6 months after his loss. And this preacher said to me, I hope you can help him. It's time for him to be over this. And I thought, oh my. All of those degrees, all of that knowledge, and you don't know the first thing about grief. He'll someday die himself and he'll not be over it until he dies. I knew Kubler-Ross's stages. I knew about denial, and anger, and bargaining, and depression, and acceptance, and finally hope. But my process of grief wasn't all some nice, neat thing where you deny it at first, and then you get angry, and then you bargain, and then you are depressed, and then you accept it, and then you have hope, and you're done. You're healed. I slipped and slid around in the grief process for a long time. I'd take 2 steps forward and one step backwards. That's why folks, you need to know this. You can visit a person who's had a loss in their life and you say, they're really doing great. I was there the other day. And somebody goes a week later and said, they're a mess. As if you do better this day and you're a mess this day, but then it's all neatly packaged. No, it's not. It's up and down. It's tears and laughter. It's I want to talk and I don't want to talk. It's I'm angry and I'm not angry. I'm depressed and I'm not depressed. I have hope and I don't have hope. I learned when sorrow walked with me that God is good and compassionate and comforting. Though I was angry with God at first, He didn't strike me dead. I don't think He does that. I think He knew me. He never forsook me. And I learned the truthfulness of that passage that Bill read, "Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of mercies, and the God of all comfort." And He stood with me. And I found solace in Him. He and I had lots of long talks. I said what was on my heart. And He heard me. I learned that grief is healthy. Grief doesn't mean something's wrong. Grief means something's right. It's not a sign of weakness. It's trying to cope with a great, terrible loss. It's trying to get out of that black hole. And it's going to take a while. You see, you can grieve now or you can grieve later. You remember the Fram oil filter commercial? Fellow holds the filter up and says, "Pay me now or pay me later." Grief's that way. You can grieve at the time, or you can suppress it, and it'll come out sometime, maybe in a way you don't want it to. Members of the church here know my dear friend Sam Bartrug, what affection we have for one another. He preached Judy's funeral. He tried to be very strong for me. He was my preacher more than he was my friend at that time. He told me that months later he was watching a Western on television. And all of a sudden he started crying because something had happened to some character in the movie. He said, "I sat there and I cried and I cried and I cried. My body shook." And he said, "Why am I crying? It's a stupid movie." And he said, then it dawned on me. I was not really grieving, crying for the person in the movie who died. I was grieving for my friend Judy who died. And I had suppressed it. And finally it came out. It'll do that, you know. I fought it. But I did better when I admitted I'm grieving. Be patient with me. I'm grieving. I'll try to find my way through this. I'm grieving. Pray for me. I'm grieving. Sit and listen while I talk and don't be judgmental. Don't tell me about somebody you had who died It's about me right now. Grant me that. Let it be about me and my grief right now. Don't play a game of one-upmanship to let me know that you've suffered more than I suffered. Just listen. I learned that life goes on, but our experiences become a new normal. My life did go on. Several months after Judy died, I was to hold a meeting in Bell, West Virginia. I remember driving there that morning. I noticed on the steering wheel that I was still wearing my wedding band. I just couldn't take it off. Didn't seem right to take it off. But that morning, for some reason, I said, I can take it off. I took it off and put it in my pocket. I was to stay with one of the elders and his wife, and I said to her, you know, there's a woman in this town I went to school with. Her name is Sierra Lowry. We were best friends. Went everywhere together. Never anything romantic at all. We just were great friends. She had a boyfriend, I had a girlfriend. We just hung out. They said, she's back. She had lived out west. I wanted to see her. I found out that she was single. She knew I was. And I looked at her with different eyes this time than I had when we were students at Ohio Valley College. We were married, have been for 32 years now. And my life is good. But it's a new normal for me. I look at things differently. I think about things differently. And I miss my parents so badly. My father was a hard man. It was this way. But he loved me. He was proud of me. And I got to spend the last few years of his life with him. He had Alzheimer's at the end. There are diseases that I hate. Alzheimer's is one of them. Cancer is one of them. ALS is one of them. It left his body, but it took his mind. He would say funny things. He would say sad things. Most always he knew me, but there are times I'd like to talk to him. I was a mama's boy. As a matter of fact, when she died, I was standing by her casket, and one of her distant relatives came up and said, "You're Libby's son." I said, "Yes, how do you know?" She said, "Oh, child, look at you." I was a spitting image of my mother. She died a year exactly before Judy did. I'd like to talk to her again. But life goes on. I learned some things when sorrow walked with me, and my life is good. It's just different. I don't have the same traditions at Christmas I had when Judy was alive. I'm a whole lot more carefree. You see, when she was alive, it was all of the things we were going to do when our children were older and reared and out of the house, and we never got to that point. So I'm more spontaneous now. although I could never match the spontaneity of my wife. She's one of those, let's go, let's try this way. It may get us there. It may not, but we'll have fun on the trip. We'll find some place to eat somewhere, maybe. But I've learned a new normal. And I've learned, finally, that people need me. Over the years, I've spoken so many times about grief. And people come to me and say, "Can you help me?" Sometimes I can. I've always wanted to write a book about grief. As a matter of fact, the title of it would be When Sorrow Walked With Me. I'm not really disciplined enough to be a writer. I start and then I quit and file that someplace in my computer that I forget where it is and start again. And recalling my own losses are painful. But people do need to know that I care about them, that I have some insights into their experience. And I've learned the best thing you can do when somebody's grieving is just listen. And please don't be judgmental. I had people tell me when I was angry with God, "You shouldn't be angry with God," okay, but I am. Leave me alone. "You shouldn't have done that." Maybe you're right, but I did. Leave me alone. I value the people who came and sat and listened. Not the people who told me that we ought to have gotten a fourth opinion after a third one, or that we ought to have had a more radical procedure, or that they wouldn't have gone to that hospital, wouldn't take their dog to that hospital. They don't like that doctor. I should have gotten this doctor. Listen, people, don't do that, please. It doesn't help anybody through anything. I don't really like the phrase, "it is what it is," but it is what it is, and it was what it was. And I can't undo it, and I can't change anything about it. And one of the best days of my life was when somebody explained to me, "Tom, you did the best you could with what you knew at the time. Now let it go." Hold her in your heart. But let the anger go. And I did. And please, as I said before, don't play the one-upmanship game with people. If they're grieving, let them tell you their story. They don't need to hear your story. Because yours is always worse or better. God, who comforts us in all our tribulation, that we may be able to comfort those who are in any trouble with the comfort with which we ourselves are comforted by God. I really believe in some ways that God was preparing me through my losses, and even now through the loss of my health, which I grieve so much about, to be able to listen to other people and to help them. Because you see, that's really what life is about, isn't it? Especially as the family of God, that's what it's about. It's people who are trying to help other people through all of the difficulties and griefs of life. You've listened so wonderfully well, so patiently, and I thank you for that. And I've told you my story. Now, if you would like to tell yours, if you have a question, If you have a comment, I'd be glad to entertain that for the next few minutes before we have our lunch together.
I think it's interesting the point you brought up. You know, most of the time when we talk about grief, we think about the loss of a loved one.
Yes.
But it's more than that. It's things that are close to us that we hold dear. And, you know, really, I hadn't thought about
Yep.
that. And I am a really deep thinker.
Yeah, Brian's made the observation that we do grieve about anything that we hold dear, the loss of anything dear. And I've said, Brian, that divorce is a terrible grief. It is. It's a terrible grief. And sometimes it's worse than a death because the person is still there, and especially if there are children involved, and we have that interaction and we try to work through that, and divorce can cause a terrible, terrible grief. And everybody in this audience today, I would think, is grieving about something. And as a preacher, that's something we have to understand. When we stand up in front of our people on Sunday morning, we are facing people who are grieving because they've lost something. And sometimes the only comfort we give them is when we quit preaching. But you're right, and we need to understand that people grieve over any significant loss, and they get to determine what's significant. That cat dying to Sierra and me was significant. Other people could care less about cats. They hate them. But to us, that was a significant loss. So I get to determine what's significant. Everybody else doesn't. Oh, yeah.
Loss of certain things.
Oh, yeah.
Like, loss of hair.
Yes.
Loss of, health and
Yeah.
things like that. And to be one of the things through the years is learning to be patient with one another
Yes.
in their grief process and supporting
Yes.
each other
Yeah.
through that. And when you're finding your way
Yes.
of how you're going to accept the new normal. And the other comment I had was often we overlook and don't think the elderly
Yes.
and kids grieve
Yeah.
because they don't grieve the way we think
Yes.
they do. And so to really look and help them through that, and the only way you can do that is by listening and trying to figure out what's going to get them to open up so that they know people are there to help them.
Lynn's made an observation that even men and women grieve differently, and we need to be patient with one another, and that elderly people and young people grieve. There are several things that affect the way we grieve. Our rearing. How many of us were reared, big boys don't cry, and so we think we have to have stiff upper lip? Well, I remember Jesus wept, and I think I'm in pretty good company when I do. Men and women grieve differently. Women seem to have more permission to grieve, to weep. How the loss occurred. Sudden losses, unexpected losses, are dealt with generally more in a different way than those that we expect. I tell people, I grieved for 2.5 years before Judy died because I knew she was going to. And we held one another and cried. And she would say things. I remember our last vacation, she loved the beach, and we went to the ocean, and we were standing there watching the sunset, and I said, "It's getting chilly, let's go in." She said, "No, I want to stay here a while longer." And so we did, and I finally said, "Hey, honey, it's getting really dark, we need to go." And she said, "No, I want to stay here a little longer." And I was really stupid. Okay. I said, "Why?" She said, "It's the last time I'll ever see this." And it was. And so we grieved for 2.5 years. There are other people who don't start grieving until it's the announcement there was a car wreck and somebody died, And so how we're supported by people, there are just so many things that affect the way we grieve. And I think we just have to be patient with one another and let one another grieve in the way that we must grieve, and not say, well, you ought to be over this, or quit crying, you've done this long enough. We just have to be patient. Now, I understand that grief can go on and become unhealthy eventually, but most of us are ill-equipped to know when that point is.
I was just going to say there is such a thing as complex grief.
Yes.
A professional
Yes.
one needs to take
And then a professional has to deal.
and to support them in that.
Yes.
And let them know that
Yes.
that's okay.
Yes. I think that churches ought to have a grief recovery, grief support group of some kind where people who are grieving. This church at Seymour has been hit so hard the last little while with things that cause us to grieve. People who are dealing with cancer, people who have passed away, people who are ill. It just has been a terrible, terrible time for us recently. And that's one reason we're having the workshop. And by the way, church, I am teaching the class Sunday morning, and we're going to deal with how we support one another in times of grief. That's what we're going to deal with. Anybody else? Thank you, Lynn, for those comments. Yes, Jeff?
Something I've learned since my mom passed away in September is, I want to say woe is me, and I feel so bad, but then yesterday, Ashlyn was getting ready for school, and she asked me if she could wear her ALS t-shirt.
Uh-huh.
And then she asked me if she could take Grandma's picture to school.
Yes.
And I thought I was moving along pretty good after the death of my mother, but I broke down crying yesterday.
Yeah.
And Katie keeps things internal. Ashlyn likes to ask questions.
Yes.
Talk about it. And, I have to remember that they're going through the holidays now for the first time
Yes.
without their grandmother.
Mm-hmm.
And as much as I feel like I'm an orphan now because my mom's gone, my dad died in 2004, and my wife is being strong for us, this will be the first holiday without me.
Yes.
And to stop every so often and ask, do you have any questions? What are you going through?
Yes.
That's tough.
Jeff's observed, for some of you who didn't hear and for the benefit of the recording, that even his children, his two daughters, are going through the grief process, and that the holidays are an especially difficult time. And that's one reason for the timing of this workshop. We wanted to, when our elder said, let's have a grief workshop, I said, let's have it in time before the holidays. My wife died in October. And I said, what are we going to do for Thanksgiving? We can't have Thanksgiving. And Jody said, well, we're going to have Thanksgiving. And somebody who had never baked a turkey before baked a turkey. And we had Thanksgiving, and we were thankful. Although we were grieving, we were thankful. But the holidays are tough when there are just things that Mom always made the pies, and she's not here to make the pies, and we always did this, and we can't do that this year, and Christmas, and just things have to become, and I keep saying the term, a new normal. Establish new traditions. It's perfectly all right for her to wear her ALS t-shirt and take your mom's picture to school with her. It's perfectly all right. That's her dealing with her loss. Let her do that. And if Thanksgiving you want to put, or Christmas you want to put a particular ornament on a tree, put a particular ornament on the tree. And let that be for you. When my wife and I were first married in 1965, Judy, we bought a topper for our tree, which was a little spire. I think we paid 39 or 49 cents for it. And for the 22 years that we were married, that was always at the top of our Christmas tree. And after she died, I said to the kids, are there things that you want? that are special to you. And both of our children had things. Yes, I want this, I want that. And Jody said, I want the topper for the tree. And every year since she passed away, it has been on the top of Jody's tree. Now Jody's well adapted. She calls Sierra Mom. She and Sierra have a wonderful wonderful relationship. But on the top of her tree is that ornament, and that's okay. That's perfectly okay. That's no disrespect to anybody. That's just a tradition. So establish your traditions and talk openly and remember the good times. And Jeff, you'll cry for the next I don't know how many years, and that's perfectly okay. And when somebody tells you ought to be over this, tell them to come and see me. Okay?
It's like, don't you agree? I grew up with my grandpa. Just thinking that at that time I was not a Christian. And now I am. And the lost ones that have come past, and you think, could I have taught them?
Yeah. Yeah, the option. Go ahead.
The guilt of that.
Yeah, yeah.
And
Yeah.
the people that you study with that won't obey the gospel. And turn that into want to take the gospel to other people.
Yes, Kenny's observed that sometimes we grieve, especially over those who are non-Christians who die. And maybe we could have had the opportunity to teach them, to lead them to the Lord. And that is a guilt, and I can't deny that. And we grieve as Christians, but not as those who have no hope. We grieve differently for those who have no hope, which ought to be an impetus for us to do all that we can to lead people to the Lord, to help them see what it means to be a Christian, to teach them the things that are involved. I would encourage you not to beat yourself up for that, for what you should have done or could have done, but let that be kind of an impetus. I'm going to do better. I'm really going to teach people. I'm going to care about people. So that's a good point, Kenny. Thank you for that.
You know, I think we grieve the ones that maybe we couldn't turn. But then I think if I hadn't tried, then I wouldn't have gotten to baptize my mother
Yes.
a couple of months before she died.
Yes.
And so when she died, I knew that she knew where she was going.
Yes.
And she was a shepherd. And there was some strength there.
And that's a precious promise, isn't it? The observation is, and for those of you who don't know, that Jeff baptized his mother. She was in a wheelchair. It was an ordeal. It was very painful for her. It took a lot of time and patience. But those of us who were there to witness that, it was one of the most beautiful, moving things I've ever seen. And to know that she wanted to make sure that things were well with her soul, and that she went through that process even though it was painful and difficult for her. She was a woman of great courage, and that gives Jeff comfort now in knowing where she is, and I believe that. I can't, I'm not the judge, and I don't preach people into heaven, but I have every reason to believe that things are well with her soul and that she is resting in Abraham's bosom, that paradise of God. Anybody else? Yes, ma'am.
A lot of times that when you've lost somebody, other people don't want to talk about them because it hurts. And it's kind of like they tiptoe around
Yes.
talking about them. But I love talking about my mother.
Yeah.
I love all the memories. I don't want anybody to quit talking about her.
The observation is, and I say this for the benefit of the tape, that sometimes we are hesitant to talk about people who have passed away because we're afraid that it's painful, maybe for us or for the other person. Most of the things I've learned, some good woman's taught me. And when I was in Canton, Ohio, there was a couple, Walt and Boots Young, who were just wonderful, wonderful people, adopted my family. They were surrogate parents to us. And Walt died at 66 with a heart attack. And I preached his funeral, and everybody was there from the United States congressman to the town drunk. It took 2 hours standing in line to pass past his casket. He was an ordinary man, mail carrier, but everybody loved him. And his wife, Boots, came to me one day and she said, "You don't talk about Walt anymore." And I said, "Well, Boots, let me tell you why. Every time I do, you cry." She said, "Yes, but when you don't talk about him, it makes me think you've forgotten him. And I want to know that you remember him." So from there on, I talked openly and freely about Walt and about the fun things that we had done and the trips we had taken and the times we had laughed. And I think it was therapeutic for her and for me. So I'm not afraid to talk about somebody who has passed. Now, I think we need to do it with respect. And I think we ought to dwell on the good things, the positive things, the happy things. I don't think we have to say, "Well, yeah, she really suffered there at the end." That doesn't help anybody. But we talk about the good things that happened and the times that we remember that are precious to us, because it's that way that keeps memories alive. And we need to keep those memories alive in our hearts. Absolutely. Good observation. Anybody else? Well, I thank you so much